What is up, everybody? Josh Tapp here again, and welcome back to the Lucky Titan. Today, we're here with Ryan Estes. Now, guys, this guy, I've spoken with him once or twice at this point. I love the company that these guys have built. It's called Kitcaster, and if you're a podcaster, you know all about this company because I really do think these guys are going to really take the market when it comes to booking people on other people's podcasts. They've referred to some of the best guests that you guys have seen have come from Kitcaster, so I'm stoked to see where they're going with their company. But when I talked to Ryan about coming here on the show, I was like, hey, this will be a great opportunity for us to dive into the story aspect and the why behind podcasting, because, you know, a lot of you who listen to this have thought it's probably crossed your mind, I should probably have a show at some point, or maybe I should go on shows at some point, but you haven't taken the leap simply because it probably feels like there's too many barriers in between you and that. And what we're here to do today is to help remove those barriers and convince you to choose either to start a podcast, to go on podcasts, or both. Ideally both, but we both make money when you guys do both. So, but Ryan, first off, say what's up to everybody and we'll hop in, man.
Hey, everybody. Josh, I really appreciate being on your show. I'm a fan of your show. I love what you do, particularly for podcasting, and I'm so excited to have a podcast conversation here.
Yeah, that's what we should name it, the podcasty podcast.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, it just feels like kind of an inception concept where we're talking about podcasting in podcasting. And many people know this who listen to this show. I've actually really heavily considered changing the entire theme of the show or starting a new show entirely around podcasting, monetizing it, scaling it, growing it, because ultimately that's what we do for a living. But I don't know, I just love talking to people in other industries too. You get bored just talking to podcasters all day, right?
I haven't yet.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah. I haven't either. I'm just teasing. So I do want to ask you this though, Ryan, because, and I asked this to most of my guests, but what was that epiphany moment when you realized podcasting was going to be your niche? Was that sector that you thought you'd fall in love with?
Yeah, you know what? I was a young entrepreneur. This might have been 15 years ago. And I started what would be Denver's first social media marketing agency. This was before Facebook Business Manager. This is before Instagram existed. I was kind of coming off the heels of MySpace. I had a band that toured and recorded here in Denver. And as a product of that, used MySpace pretty heavily to promote the music. And then other bands were like, hey, can you do this? Can you build websites? And I start to see the opportunity here. So I started that. In the beginning, it was kind of a side thing because it wasn't necessarily bringing home the bacon, and I had a couple small children. So the job I had was probably 90 minutes away, one way. And it was brutal. The commute was just killing me. So, I ran through my playlists on my iPod at the time pretty quick. You can only listen to so much Led Zeppelin and Tupac before you're like, all right, I need something else, and it's not going to be the radio. So podcasting at this point was still, you had to download it into your iPod, which took maybe an hour, and then you played it back. And so that kind of started the journey. I was listening to Rogan early on and comedians early on, and then kind of got into the iTunes, Apple podcast ecosystem and realized anything I was into, there was a podcast for that. There was one particular podcast called Field of Weeds that was a series of essays from this Zen expat monk that was living in LA, and it was just so gorgeous. So I really fell in love with the medium. About the same time, my music career was coming to an end, largely because of these children staring at me with hungry eyes, and realizing that that's where my time was going to go. And I was really kind of bummed out about not playing music anymore. So I was like, I'm going to start a podcast, and had to convince my wife what that was. And then I convinced the band what that was. And I was like, look, guys, it's just like the band just sitting around talking trash, only we're not doing music. It's just that. And so they were in. So I started a podcast called 8th Grade Ball early on and had a little success with it. And that was it. I've been hooked since then.
It's funny to me to see that transition story for a lot of people, because you're one of the OGs in the space. I got into podcasting, I want to say maybe 10 years ago. And at that point, it was already pretty popularized. We were still in the early phases, but I mean, you could pull it up on your phone and and you didn't have to download it or whatnot. You could just
Yeah.
stream it. I think 3G was around at that point, but um
That 3G moment was glorious when it was like, I can just stream it. Oh my
right.
gosh, that was amazing.
But and it makes me laugh to think how many of us wouldn't even listen to podcasts nowadays if we had to download it. I mean,
Yeah,
I would, if people ask me to watch a video half the time, I'm like, it's
I
too
don't
much
got
work.
time for that.
Yeah, give me a podcast. I can do it while I'm driving or working out or something. Um,
Yeah.
and it's fun to see that transition story, because what happens for most people with podcasting is that pretty much everybody whoops is into it, right? They're like, yeah, I've listened to a few, and they're like, why don't I try it? And then you realize it's really not that hard to start a show. And when you did, it was probably much more difficult, because you probably had to manually host it yourself, and unless you had
Recording
Libsyn or something.
studio and the whole thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's I mean, the production experience is crazy. And nowadays you can pull up anchor.fm and have a podcast in 2 minutes,
Yeah.
So it's cool to see that you guys have done that. And so you've pivoted, and then with Kitcaster and everything, you guys have basically built an environment where people can come in and actually start to amplify their story without having to worry about the production value, because they can go on other people's shows. Now, I do want to ask you this too, because, and this is actually a genuine question I have, like, what's the actual ROI of going and speaking on podcasts? Because, like if I go speak at an event, I know I'm going to close a few sales, right? And for us,
Yep.
that's $20,000-$30,000 a month in revenue, and we do that. So like, there's a lot of ROI there. But then when I go on podcasts, it's more of kind of a branding activity. It's always seemed where like I do get a lot of exposure, but I don't typically get direct sales from going on those shows. So I'm just kind of curious what you guys have seen the ROI to be.
Yeah, I think that's pretty consistent with our experience. It's very good with brand building. If we're talking about return, especially, we work with a lot of marketing directors, and they're very accustomed to neat and tidy spreadsheets.
Right.
And podcasting is a little squishy. So, we work typically with funded startup founders, entrepreneurs with exits, C-suite executives. And they all have kind of different outcomes that they're looking for. Everybody wants prospects for sure, but some folks come on and their main priority is recruiting, or their main priority is adding runway. So we have kind of case studies and success stories for pretty much every single outcome you can imagine. But generally, as a rule, what we'll see is folks that have a longer sales cycle and a higher LTV do really well with podcasting. You can get also, because podcasts are kind of always out there. You might have a podcast you recorded 10 months ago and it pops back up on someone's radar. They reach out, you close the deal. So those tend to do really well. Folks that are kind of trying to move widgets, it's a little more challenging, particularly because the urgency of like a launch. Let's say you're writing a book, and you go out there and you're like, hey, March 15th, I want to sell X amount of copies, and you strategize everything to run towards that. Well, it's really hard for someone who's folding laundry and listening to podcasts and hears about your book and likes it to stop what they're doing, go to the website, go to Amazon and convert. So, if it's actually like a CPG good or something like that, that is kind of lower customer value, podcasting, as far as like just straight purchases, might not be the best conversion for you.
Right.
The other side of that, though, is if you do have a sophisticated marketing department and you can repurpose the content, then you're creating evergreen assets that can work inside your sales funnel forever. And particularly if you have kind of like an undifferentiated kind of market, this is an opportunity that somebody might go with you just because they like you as a founder, as opposed to maybe a competitor that they don't know.
Yeah. Well, I love that. And it's what's interesting, what we've seen about it too. And you kind of touched on this. I like the way you worded it though, because instead of saying networking, it's like it really is a great tool for B2B or high ticket sales. I always say B2B when I say high ticket sales, but I know they're two different things. But most high ticket sales are B2B, high ticket recurring sales in particular. And I've seen that same thing, is like, it's never a waste of my time to go on those shows, because every once in a while somebody say, oh, I heard your interview on this, and that was what kind of locked them in to want to reach out to me. And 6 months later they did, and they then they buy immediately, and they're great, because it's almost like a referral at that point, because you've built that brand strength
Yeah.
by just going on these shows. And then you also mentioned repurposing those assets and leveraging those. Obviously that's like what we do as a business, is repurpose those assets for people. And we found that just doing that makes it so that when somebody is looking for you, they're like, wow, I know this person, right? Because the one thing that you can honestly know about going on shows or having your own show is that you gain someone's trust when they listen to you, right? Because you're going to build rapport with them just simply because of that, that the relationship that they're having with you, in those intimate moments when they're driving and they're meditating and you're in their ear gabbing away,
Yeah.
it's a huge authority booster. I know for myself, when I'm in meditation mode in my car and I'm going on long trips, I throw on Russell Brunson's podcast and I don't even listen to it half the time. It's just in the background, but simply like his energy and everything keeps my brain awake and keeps me thinking about business. I'll go through 8 episodes and be like, oh, I don't even remember anything I learned from there, but I had all these epiphanies and other things that came from just listening. And he's, I'm a funnel hacker for life,
Is that the one he does in his car?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah. Oh man, that's pretty meta.
Mm-hmm.
It's like you're having a one-way conversation on different lanes of traffic.
Yeah, exactly.
That's neat.
We actually live pretty close together to each other. So I'm like, maybe one day we'll pass each other. I'll be listening and he'll be recording at the same time.
He'll be recording. Whoa.
Yeah. And I'll be like, hey, I'll honk so I can so that I can be in one of his episodes, right?
You can hear it a week later.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's and the reason I bring these topics up, is because like we talked about this, is that podcasting in general is a great sales tool. It really is. Being on podcast, having your own podcast, listening to podcasts, they're all fantastic sales tools. And ultimately, I think people like you and us, we've learned to maximize on that experience and saying, how do we help people make real significant change? But there's one thing that I think you guys do more so than anybody else I've seen, that you provide your clients with training on how to develop their story. And as a host, this is huge for someone like me, because when I bring somebody on the show and they're either spitting facts or like, there's just some people who literally just talk and say nothing for hours. And luckily for all of you, I protect you and I don't post those episodes. I mean, we'll have an hour conversation. I don't get a single takeaway from it. I'm like, that's sad. But so you kind of have those two different lanes, but then you have the people who come on and they've got a great story. They're really good at being dynamic, because their shows are not always the same. They're not always structured the same. The questions will always be different. So how would you recommend that people learn to master their story?
You bet. Our kind of story crafting came from kind of a blind spot that I had. I've been podcasting for so long and done so many episodes, and like you said, been on the other side as an interviewer and worked with people that you ask them a question, they say yes or no, and then you got to just fill up the space.
Right.
So I think because of my comfort level with podcasting, I forgot about the big emotions that can really arise from going on a podcast, particularly if it's your first time, or first couple of times, or it's a big show. The nerves really come up. And what we saw from our clients is that is expressed in different ways, but usually it's a little bit of chaotic energy. And
Right.
What we noticed after, 4 or 5 podcast episodes, that chaotic energy was kind of harmonized naturally and went away. So in kind of investigating, what that is, asking our clients, hey, what was going on at the beginning of the campaign? A lot of it had to do with this big anxious energy that came up from podcasting. In particular, the first 5 minutes of show, where they say, Josh, tell me a little bit about yourself. How did you think of this product? These broad, open-ended questions, and you're just sitting there like, and everything starts swarming you, and you get kind of freaked out, the butterflies. Right. So what we wanted to do is give folks a head start, and it's not really that difficult to do. So really it's about opening people up, and getting them to talk about their history and where they come from. What you need is, like, let's say 4, 5, 6 anecdotes that you can use that will help kind of let the audience know where you're coming from. Gives a little bit of information about how old you are, your family situation, your career, where you're at, your aspirations, your dreams, your hopes, all of these things that intuitively come out in stories, that you can have prepared, or at least kind of sitting next to you, that if you need to go to something, you can have it. And so we kind of spend time with them and help them kind of pull out these stories, and then deliver back to them maybe a little cheat sheet so that they can cue those up in the heat of the moment, as it were. And it really helps. Like I said, we're dealing with a lot of tech founders. We're dealing with a lot of folks that spend a lot of time in front of glowing rectangles. And just the idea of, mass communication is just enough in itself to kind of get the heart rate up a little bit. So hopefully, we've designed this kind of process to help bed down some of those fears and give them some confidence going into the interviews.
Yeah. Well, and I love that, because ultimately the story is what sucked people in. I actually had a coach recently, and as you were talking, I have to write this down because it's stuck in my head really well. But he was telling me, he's like, Josh, you're spending too much of your time sharing your highlight reel. He's like, start showing your fail videos, right? Like everybody loves those, right? Fail Army or AFV or whatever you follow, right? They're constantly showing. I watch those all the time because they're just funny, first off, but they're highly relatable. You think about the stories. I mean, the one that always comes to mind, I think, of fail videos is people trying to swing into a river on the rope swings, and they break or they fall or they bounce or something, right? And I can never get enough of those. So if you have some good videos, shoot those my way. I love to see them.
All of meat.
Exactly. Exactly. But you look at those and they're so relatable because all of us have done it. We've tried to jump onto a swing, and one of my favorite stories of my best friend was, we were trying to swing across a canal, and he was like, I could do this, because it was like 40 degrees outside, and just fell into the water. It was hilarious, right? Some of my favorite moments, but it sticks with me, right? And if somebody were to tell a story like that on a podcast and relate it to a business principle, they'd have so much more clout with me, because I'm like, I get it. I've done it, fell flat in the mud before. And those are sort of stories that I feel like stick. And you mentioned 5 or 6 anecdotes. How are you helping the clients get to that point? Because everybody sits here going, and I think it's because they're thinking of their highlight reel. They're like, I don't really have 6 success stories yet, but where are they pulling these stories from?
It's a bit of a science and an art. And depending on how many layers you kind of have to get through to get someone's confidence, they might all come out at the last 5 minutes of the conversation. Brandy, our co-founder, who's wonderful, she's been in PR for 10 years, and she's great at doing that. But we also have another woman who's incredibly accomplished that does it for us too, named Lori. So I'm not on many of these, but I remember I was talking to a client, and particularly around kind of this story crafting, and he lives in the Bay Area. And he's like, I don't know why someone would want to talk to me. I was like, tell me about that. Like, what's your story? Where you come from? And he's like, oh, it's that classic. Everyone's got the story. I showed up in LA with a briefcase and $20 and yada, yada, yada. 10 years later, me and my brother just raised $20 million. And I was like, yada, 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 bro.
Yeah.
I know that
2 million's a lot, or 20 million's a lot.
I know that's really common in the Bay, but people want to hear that story. That's a great story. Right. So getting over kind of people's like imposter syndrome, and getting over people's maybe self-deprecating nature, and just kind of piecing together and saying like, no, this is great. So the art form is making them feel comfortable to share some personal details, within boundaries. We all have different layers of trauma and things, and like, we don't want to necessarily burst into tears, while we're on a podcast. So navigating that takes like a certain intuition, and trust that is built over time, I think. And then just the ability to kind of differentiate the stories that might help introduce yourself to an audience, but then also kind of like lead the audience to the outcomes you're looking for. So it might not be appropriate if you're just recruiting you might leave some of these anecdotes behind and choose some others. So it really it's all kind of customized to what they want to get out and how comfortable they are with their own history and story.
Right. Yeah, I love that. And it's so funny that people will, oh, there's an alarm. You got me. I thought it was mine.
Yeah, oh man.
Things out.
I just
So
figured out how to change the alarm. So I'm switching that sound. Everyone in my office jumps every time that goes off.
it's yeah, you scared me. I'm like, when did I set that alarm?
What is it?
It's awesome. So your clock's ahead, by the way. It's 12:29 here. Anyways, I digress. So coming back though, full circle, I love that in particular because you're really talking about removing that posturing and getting more transparent with how we share our stories, and getting back to those, getting over the imposter syndrome, and I really feel like a lot of it's false humility. 'Cause I also had a coach, this is years ago, who told me, he's like, start bragging about yourself. It's
Mm,
not a problem to share your numbers and to, brag about the accomplishments that you've done, as long as you don't let it go to your head and think you're better than other people, or you're better than you don't feel like you can help somebody else who is below you, quote unquote. You can't help them get, because that's what you're supposed to do is you climb a stair, then you help the other person get up to that step with you. And if you watch, you
yeah.
just hold on tight, because that person will probably go past you and carry you with them, right? And so it's such an interesting, I don't know if dichotomy is the right word, but you really do need to learn to speak to your successes and be willing to share them and not feel uncomfortable about sharing them, even if it seems small compared to somebody else's, but you're really sharing about how difficult it was for you. Because I know,
No,
oh, go
yeah.
ahead. You go ahead.
And I think sharing that it's uncomfortable to share is great. A lot of
Right.
people feel that way. It's uncomfortable for me if you really have that modesty. You're like, hey, I want to share this stuff. It's hard for me to share, and go forward anyway. That's bravery. But the other side, if it's false modesty, like, I mean, the Bible describes that as a sin against God. You know what I
Right.
mean? Like, if you're
Yeah.
proud of what you got, don't don't cowtail because you think you're gonna come off arrogant or something. I mean, there's a line to play with here, but it's okay to have success. It's okay to be excited about it, and
Yeah.
that energy can come through too. you know so a lot of what we work with is not necessarily that.
Right.
We've got a lot of folks that are real happy to break their hand patting themselves on the back. um
So you're more on that. Let's bring them, reel them back in. What,
right.
and like,
But
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, yeah, most of our clients, it is like helping them to see how their story is unique and amazing. And also that, like, you don't have to be super comfortable right out of the gate. Like, where you are is fine. Especially if you're feeling nervous, it really helps to dissipate the nerves by being like, wow, I'm actually kind of nervous right now.
Right.
All of this is a process. And one thing that I love about podcasting is that it's a craft of mastering speaking. And speaking itself is, and communicating is a bit of kind of a magical spell that you vibrate the air with your vocal cords, and somehow it goes into your ear, and now we have the same mental image. um, there's something amazing about it, and it's something that can be mastered, not perfected. So it's something that you always develop. So getting people an understanding that, like, you're going to make mistakes, it's okay. Where you're at is fine. If you want to approach this as like a tool to work on for the rest of your life, you'll find incredible depth in podcasting and getting better with not only telling your story, but like just being clear in your communication.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. But, and this reminds me of a story for me, right? It's like recently I've had 4 or 5 people come up to me and be like, man, you have a voice for radio. And I just laugh at that because I'm like, I don't. I have a nasally voice. I hate listening to it, right? But what's come across now after practicing, and you've probably run into the same thing for yourself, is you have a great voice for radio simply because it's not uncomfortable anymore. Right? And it comes from practicing your story. And that's why I think it's so cool to either go on other people's shows or do your own or whatnot until you feel confident doing it, because it never feels like you're speaking in front of a lot of people, because if I were to go speak on a stage in front of how many listeners we have to our show, I would be sweating every time I was going on stage. But coming on here, I'm like, I'm just talking to Ryan. It's not
Yeah.
uncomfortable for me.
Yeah, it is not the same experience. Yeah, I would
Right.
pass out on a stage.
Right.
Uh,
Well, and there's some, because I was talking to a guy the other day, he gets I want to say like 400 or 500,000 downloads an episode. And he's like, I've never spoken on a stage with more than 100 people because it terrifies me.
Yeah.
But every word that guy says is heard by 400 to 500,000 people. Like that's huge, you know?
What's interesting too is the skills don't necessarily, they're not equivocal.
Right.
We have people they're the keynote guys, you know, but that's a one-sided conversation. Unless they're getting heckled, then they are prepared. These are type A individuals, obviously, because they're giving keynotes and they have everything buttoned up perfectly.
Yeah.
But you come on a podcast with Josh and he's going to lob some like curveballs at
Total
you, you
curveballs.
know.
Yeah.
We've definitely had people that have doubled back, you know, with the storycraft. Like I've been a keynote speaker for 10 years, go on 5 podcasts and be like, let's go revisit my story.
Yeah, exactly. And I could see that. I'll be honest, like so we've interviewed almost 1,000 people from our shows. And the truth is that after a while, you start to find like little things that are funny to you, and that you know, you make it more fun for yourself. And for me, when I see someone like that who I know is completely postured and like I've got my speech prepared, I really like to talk about everything except what they came to talk about. And it's funny because like most of the time they're really uncomfortable for about 5 minutes, and then they realize I'm not here to talk about your book that you came to talk completely prepared to talk about. But then they'll end up opening up, and it becomes an amazing conversation. But it's always funny to me to see them squirm because they're like, oh, you're not asking the questions I sent you. Like, no, I'm not.
We're not going to do that. It's okay.
Yeah. And if you guys haven't noticed, Ryan is not doing that whatsoever, right? But like you said, you've got your arsenal of stories that you can hold on to, and you say, you know what, that story actually relates to that question, right? And
totally. Well, and also, I mean, the other thing I love about podcasting, particularly, you know, or particularly interview podcasts, is there's a sense of playfulness. You know, there really should be kind of a twinkle in your eye and like an improvisation in the moment, because that's what's cool about a conversation, you know, and the audience will naturally gravitate to folks that are enjoying themselves talking to each other, as opposed to kind of trying to hit all the features for the new product launch,
right?
You know, so
well, they're not going to buy it anyways if you do that. Just FYI.
Yeah, totally.
People will go buy it if you don't even mention your book. They're like, what does this guy do? They'll Google you, they'll find your book, and they'll go buy it. That's the nature of podcasting, I found. So it's funny to see all the different types of people there are that can do it. But I would tell you guys, and this is something from a host perspective, it's just so freeing to be able to have these conversations, to be able to network and immediately get into circles I never would have been able to swim in before. But the funny thing is, like, you are going to get a conversation here or there where you don't get the twinkle in your eye. You don't get that funny conversation. I had one recently that we're not going to post, and the person was just everything they came out of their mouth. I was bored to tears, first off, and second off, it was legal speak. And I just remember going, my audience is going to hate this. And so we won't publish it. You know, this is a pretty big name person. And so I feel bad not doing it, but it's also one of those things where you don't have to post it. If it sucks, you got a good lesson out of the deal, and you don't have to post it. It's not going to, don't ruin your audience or your career because you're too scared to not post somebody's stuff. So that's it. And you can ask, like, so if you go onto somebody's podcast and you feel like I did a horrible job, it's okay to say, I don't really want that posted, right? They may still post it, but most of them won't.
Yeah. Or if you say something off, just be after the show, be like, hey, would you mind editing that out? I mean, it's kind of a drag, but we've never come across a time that a host has objected. And it's probably only come up 6-7 times where someone needed to like recant, you know. I've been in a situation too where the podcast host has been an absolute neurotic mess, with a gigantic audience, you know, which is interesting. And like, it also made me feel a little more comforted to like, okay, well, I can be a good guest and support him. Obviously he's having a hard time right now. So yeah, I mean, well, and also some of the big emotions that come is it's like, you're about to talk to somebody uninterrupted that you've never met before. There's the first introduction thing that happens. And it's just a lot going on in podcasting. It's absolute just fantastic and mysterious medium. I love it.
Yeah, when the people you're meeting and the conversation just like builds trust quickly and allows you to just be friends, which you don't get a lot of that nowadays. Like being able to just walk up to somebody on the street and become friends with them. So
Yeah.
it's a really cool medium. So we've gone overtime here, Ryan, but I hope people were loving this interview because so far to me, and this has been such a fun interview for me because we can go back and forth on it. But I want to give one little piece of advice to people who want to guest. First off, two pieces would be go hire Kitcaster. These guys are awesome at what they do to help you craft their story. But I would tell you, as being the guest, go on to the show and get curious about the host and get to know and ask questions to the host. It will throw them off, but it will produce a much more listened to piece of content. I can tell you that right now. If you ask the host a question because the host is just used to asking questions all day, but if you lob the question back at them, and not a yes, no answer question, but a question evoking a story, it ends up producing a much better piece of content, a much better conversation, kind of like Ryan and I've been doing here. I think this will be a great one that people will listen to and hopefully inspire a lot of you to go and either start a show or go guest on other people's shows. But so one last call to action here, guys, go to kitcaster.com. Make sure you guys go and register for that. See what those guys are doing over there. It's an amazing service. But then Ryan, I do want to ask you if you could give us as a podcaster one final parting piece of guidance, what would that be?
As a podcaster, maybe I'll speak to folks that are on the fence and they're thinking about starting a podcast. I obviously really encourage that. The advice I would give is if you're going to do it, commit and don't be too harsh on yourself. One rule I gave myself in the beginning so I didn't, get freaked out at the way my voice sounded or like feel like a complete idiot. Or I have a very drill sergeant-y inner narrator that kind of holds my feet to the fire all the time. So to combat that, I said, you know what? I'm going to record 100 episodes and I'm not going to judge myself until the 101st. So if you're on the fence, should I start a podcast? Yes, you should. What should it be about? You got 100 episodes to figure it out. Be nice to yourself on the way.